January 1942 brought an unprecedented sight to the fog-shrouded streets of London. As dawn broke over a city still smoldering from German bombing raids, the first transport ships carrying African-American soldiers began docking at Liverpool. Within hours, trains carried these men southward toward the capital, where Londoners would witness something their insular society had scarcely imagined. Thousands of black American servicemen in uniform arriving to help defend a nation most had only read about in books. 17-year-old Margaret Thornton pressed her face against the cold window of her Paddington flat as the olive-drab trucks rolled past. She'd never seen a black person before that morning. In her entire life in London's West End, the only people of color she'd encountered were the occasional diplomat or wealthy colonial visitor. Now convoy after convoy rumbled through her neighborhood, filled with young men whose skin color marked them as foreigners in a way their American accents alone never could. "Ma'am, come look at this," she called out, her breath fogging the glass. Her mother, Alice Thornton, wiped flour-dusted hands on her apron and joined her daughter. The older woman's expression shifted from curiosity to something more complex, a mixture of surprise, uncertainty, and perhaps a glimmer of the racial attitudes inherited from an empire built on colonial dominance. "Well," she said quietly, "I suppose the war makes for strange company." Down on the street, Sergeant James Mitchell of the 93rd Engineer Regiment noticed the faces in the windows. He'd been warned during briefings aboard the transport ship that Britain would be different from the Jim Crow South he'd left behind in Alabama. The Army brass had given lectures about British customs, about how to behave, about representing America abroad. What they hadn't prepared him for was the stares, not hostile exactly, but intense, as though he and his fellow soldiers were exotic creatures escaped from a zoo. "Keep your eyes forward, men," barked Lieutenant Morrison, a white officer from Connecticut. "Remember what you were told? We're guests here." The trucks continued through London's battered streets, passing bombed-out buildings where families had died just weeks earlier. Air raid shelters still bore the scent of fear and unwashed bodies. Yet despite the destruction, despite the privation of rationing and blackouts, the British capital maintained its peculiar dignity. Red double-decker buses still ran their routes. Children still played in rubble-strewn parks. And now, these black Americans, had arrived to join the fight. By evening, the pubs near the newly established American bases began filling with curious Londoners. The White Hart and Bethnal Green became an unlikely meeting ground where worlds collided. Publican Robert Davies found himself pouring pints for soldiers whose presence sparked heated debates among his regular patrons. "They're here to help us, ain't they?" argued dockworker Thomas Webb, his weathered face still bearing soot from his day's labor. "Color doesn't matter when Jerry's dropping bombs on your head." But not everyone agreed. The British establishment, particularly those with connections to the United States, had received quiet diplomatic communications about maintaining American racial protocols, according to records later examined by historians researching wartime Anglo-American relations. The British government faced pressure to accommodate segregationist policies that contradicted their own developing attitudes toward race. As that first day ended, London found itself at a crossroads. The Americans had arrived, bringing both salvation and complication. In sitting rooms and street corners, in government offices and military headquarters, the question hung unspoken but urgent. How would Britain respond to these unexpected liberators who wore their country's uniform but were denied its full citizenship? The answer would emerge in the months ahead, surprising everyone involved. February 1942 transformed London into a laboratory of racial attitudes. The initial shock of seeing black American troops gave way to something more nuanced, a complex dance of curiosity,
prejudice,
hospitality, and political calculation that would define Anglo-American relations for the remainder of the war. Colonel Theodore Hartman arrived at the American Embassy on Grosvenor Square with explicit instructions from Washington. The War Department had grown concerned about reports filtering back across the Atlantic. British civilians were treating black soldiers with what segregationist commanders considered dangerous equality. White American officers found themselves in the awkward position of trying to export Jim Crow to a nation that, while certainly harboring its own racial prejudices, had no legal framework for enforcing American-style segregation. "The British don't understand our customs," Hartman explained to Ambassador John Wynant during a tense meeting that February. "They're socializing with the colored troops as though they were equals. It's causing discipline problems." Wynand, a former governor of New Hampshire with progressive leanings, found himself caught between military demands and diplomatic reality. The British government, led by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, needed American support desperately. But British society, particularly working-class Londoners who'd borne the brunt of the Blitz, proved stubbornly resistant to imported racial hierarchies. Meanwhile, in the streets of London, a quieter revolution unfolded. Private William Jackson from Chicago discovered that British women didn't recoil from his presence. At a church social in Hammersmith, organized by volunteers determined to make American troops feel welcome, Jackson found himself dancing with Emily Patterson, a factory worker whose husband was serving in North Africa. "You dance wonderfully," Emily said, her cheeks flushed from exertion and the novelty of the moment. Jackson, accustomed to the rigid racial boundaries of home, felt disoriented by her casual friendliness. "Thank you, ma'am. We don't usually. Back home, this wouldn't happen." Emily's brow furrowed. "Why ever not? You're fighting for freedom, aren't you? Seems daft to treat you differently because of your complexion." This sentiment echoed in dance halls and pubs across London, infuriated white American officers. But it resonated deeply with ordinary Britons who'd endured years of hardship and saw little logic in the racial distinctions Americans insisted upon. The British had their own class prejudices, certainly, and their empire had committed countless atrocities against people of color. Yet in the intimate space of wartime London, face to face with actual black Americans rather than colonial abstractions, many Britons found their assumptions challenged. The BBC took notice. Radio broadcasts began featuring stories about the colored American troops helping the war effort. One March broadcast, preserved in BBC archives, featured an interview with a black engineer battalion that had helped repair bomb damage to essential infrastructure. The announcer's tone carried genuine respects, something that would have been unthinkable on American radio stations at the time. Not everyone welcomed this development. Sir Edmund Pritchard, a conservative member of Parliament with business interests in the American South, raised concerns in private meetings with government officials. He worried that friendly treatment of black troops would damage relations with influential white Americans and potentially harm post-war trade relationships. His concerns reflected a faction within British society that remained aligned with American segregationist thinking. But ordinary Londoners, particularly those in working-class neighborhoods where American troops were billeted, developed their own perspectives. Mary Sullivan, who ran a boarding house in Brixton, began accepting black soldiers as lodgers when they had leave. Her decision sparked controversy among some neighbors, but also attracted support from others who admired her Christian principles. "They're far from home, fighting our battle," she told a local reporter. "The least we can do is offer them a decent bed and a hot meal. Their money's as good as anyone's, and their manners are considerably better than some white soldiers I could mention." This last comment referred to a growing problem. White American troops, particularly those from southern states, often behaved badly in British pubs and streets, especially when they encountered black soldiers being treated as equals. Fights broke out with increasing frequency as white soldiers attempted to enforce segregation in British establishments whose owners refused to cooperate. March 1942 witnessed the crystallization of opposing viewpoints regarding black American troops in Britain. What had begun as surprise curiosity evolved into a genuine social controversy that reached the highest levels of both governments. General Dwight Eisenhower, recently appointed to command American forces in the European theater, faced an unexpected problem. His primary mission involved preparing for an eventual invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, but he found himself mired in racial politics that threatened to undermine Anglo-American cooperation. From his headquarters in London, Eisenhower received reports of escalating tensions between white and black American troops, often triggered by British civilians' refusal to observe segregationist protocols. The British government found itself in a delicate position. According to historical documents examined by scholar Graham Smith in his work on race relations in wartime Britain, the Colonial Office advised against officially supporting American segregation policies, noting the potential impact on Britain's own colonial subjects who might question why they should support a war for freedom while accepting racial hierarchies. Yet the Foreign Office worried about antagonizing American military leadership at a critical moment in the war. In the industrial city of Bristol, the tension manifested dramatically. The town had been designated as a recreation area for American troops, with certain pubs and dance halls allocated to white soldiers and others to black soldiers. But British pub owners resented being told whom they could serve. When the landlord of the Cricketers' Arms, a popular establishment near the docks, received orders to serve only white American troops, he responded defiantly. "This is England, not Alabama," declared George Morrison, the pub's owner, to a local reporter. "I'll serve any man who behaves himself and has coin for his pint. The Yanks don't make the rules here." Morrison's stance became a rallying point. Other pub owners followed his example. The American military's attempts to enforce segregation in British establishments largely collapsed in the face of civilian resistance. This development shocked white American officers who'd assumed British cooperation with Jim Crow policies. The situation grew more complex when black soldiers began forming relationships with British women. Private Thomas Henderson from Detroit started courting Sarah Williams, a Welsh woman working as a nurse in a London hospital. Their relationship, while chaste by the standards of the time, scandalized white American officers and created diplomatic headaches. "The colored troops are forgetting their place," complained Major Robert Stevens in a memo to his superiors. "The British are encouraging behavior that would never be tolerated at home. This is undermining good order and discipline." But from the British perspective, the Americans were importing problems that had no place in their country. Home Secretary Herbert Morrison, in a confidential meeting with the War Cabinet, expressed frustration with American demands. "We're fighting Hitler's racial ideology," he noted, according to declassified cabinet minutes. "It seems rather hypocritical to then enforce racial segregation among our allies." Winston Churchill himself weighed in, though characteristically, his position proved complex and somewhat contradictory. The Prime Minister harbored his own racial prejudices, particularly regarding Britain's colonial subjects. Yet he recognized the propaganda value of treating black American troops well. The war was partly a battle for hearts and minds, and Britain's treatment of these soldiers could influence public opinion in America and around the world. The African-American press back in the United States took notice. The Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, and other black newspapers began running stories about British hospitality toward black troops. These articles provided a stark contrast to the segregation and discrimination soldiers faced at home. The coverage suggested that perhaps American racial attitudes weren't universal or inevitably a dangerous idea for segregationists. "British welcome Negro troops," read one headline in the Baltimore Afro-American. The article quoted soldiers expressing amazement at being treated like regular people in British pubs and homes. This coverage thrilled black Americans but alarmed white Southern politicians who feared the war might undermine racial hierarchies at home. By late March, violent confrontations between white and black American troops became increasingly common. In one notorious incident in Leicester, white soldiers from Georgia attacked a group of black engineers who were socializing with British women at a local dance. The resulting brawl required British police intervention and left several men hospitalized. British newspapers covered these incidents with growing dismay, often portraying white American troops as troublemakers, bringing racial violence to British soil. April 1942 brought the racial tensions surrounding black American troops to a bureaucratic crescendo. Both the American and British governments attempted to formalize their positions, producing a series of documents that revealed the deep contradictions at the heart of the Allied war effort. The American military issued what became known internally as the Notes on Relations with Colored Troops. This document, distributed to British officials and civilian leaders, attempted to explain American racial customs and request British cooperation in maintaining segregation. The notes suggested that British civilians should avoid socializing with black troops to prevent complications and maintain discipline. The document's reception in Britain ranged from bemusement to outrage. Anthony Eden, the Foreign Secretary, found himself in the uncomfortable position of receiving complaints from his own constituents, who resented being told how to treat people, according to records held at the National Archives in Kew. Eden privately expressed frustration with American racial attitudes while publicly maintaining diplomatic neutrality. Local British authorities proved even less cooperative. In Manchester, the City Council passed a resolution declaring that all American servicemen would be treated equally in municipal facilities regardless of race. The mayor, in a speech that was reported in the Manchester Guardian, declared that Britain fights against Nazi racial theories and cannot be seen supporting similar theories from our allies. This grassroots resistance to segregation caught American military planners off guard. They'd assumed British cooperation, underestimating both British pride and the practical realities of wartime social mixing. General Eisenhower, pragmatic by nature, began advocating for a more flexible approach. He recognized that attempting to enforce rigid segregation in Britain was not only impractical, but potentially counterproductive to military readiness. Meanwhile, black soldiers themselves began organizing quiet resistance to segregationist policies. Corporal Isaiah Washington from Philadelphia started an informal network helping black troops navigate London and find welcoming establishments. His handwritten guides passed from soldier to soldier, listed pubs, restaurants, and boarding houses where black Americans could expect fair treatment. "The British working class have been good to us," Washington wrote in a letter to his wife that was later preserved in military archives. "They don't seem to have the same hatred in their hearts. It makes you wonder why things have to be so different at home." These letters, when they passed through military censors, raised concerns among senior officers. The War Department worried that black soldiers' positive experiences in Britain might create unrealistic expectations about post-war racial relations in America. Some Southern congressmen even suggested recalling black troops from Britain, though practical military needs made this impossible. The British propaganda apparatus, meanwhile, saw opportunity in the situation. The Ministry of Information began producing content highlighting the diversity of Allied forces, including black American troops. These materials, distributed globally, aimed to contrast Allied values with Nazi racial ideology. British filmmaker Humphrey Jennings incorporated footage of black American soldiers in his documentary work, showing them working alongside white troops and British civilians. This propaganda, while serving British war aims, had unintended consequences. It created a public record of racial equality that would be difficult to erase after the war. Black soldiers and their supporters could point to these materials as evidence that alternatives to American segregation existed and functioned successfully. Religious organizations in Britain also entered the fray. The Church of England, through various bishops and local parishes, actively welcomed black American troops to services and social events. Reverend James Thompson of St. Martin's Church in Birmingham made headlines by publicly criticizing American segregation from his pulpit, declaring it incompatible with Christian teaching. "We are all children of God," Thompson preached in a sermon that was reprinted in several newspapers. "The color of a man's skin has no bearing on the content of his character or the worth of his soul. These American soldiers of African descent are our brothers in Christ and our allies in war. We welcome them without reservation." Such religious support provided moral legitimacy to British resistance against segregation. It became harder for American officials to dismiss criticism as mere ignorance of American customs when it came from respected religious leaders articulating principles of human dignity and equality. By month's end, an uneasy compromise emerged. The American military would not actively enforce segregation in British civilian spaces, though it would maintain separate facilities on military bases. British authorities would not officially endorse the American racial system but would avoid publicly criticizing it. Both sides hoped this informal arrangement would reduce tensions while allowing the war effort to proceed. But this compromise satisfied no one completely and resolved nothing fundamental. The underlying contradictions remained, waiting to resurface in new forms. June 1942 brought longer days and intensified preparations for eventual offensive operations against Nazi Germany. The growing American military presence in Britain included increasingly diverse units, and the racial dynamics that had caused such controversy in the spring now became normalized, though not resolved, aspects of daily life. The arrival of the 99th Pursuit Squadron at RAF Debden marked a significant milestone. These black pilots, who would later gain fame as part of the Tuskegee Airmen, brought a new dimension to the racial conversation in Britain. Unlike infantry or engineer units, these were officers. Pilots' positions that commanded respect in the military hierarchy and challenged stereotypes about black capabilities. Lieutenant Charles Harrison from Cleveland found the British reaction to black pilots particularly striking. When he visited a pub near the airfield, locals pressed him with questions about flying, combat tactics, and his training. The fact that he was black seemed secondary to their fascination with his pilot's wings. They wanted to know about aircraft, Harrison later recalled in an oral history interview. Back home, white folks would have been surprised I could read, let alone fly a fighter plane. In England, they just saw a pilot. This experience replicated across numerous encounters between black servicemen and British civilians, began shifting perceptions on both sides. British citizens discovered that black Americans were as varied as any population, educated and uneducated, skilled and unskilled, from various regions with different backgrounds. The monolithic stereotypes that shaped British colonial attitudes gave way to individual human encounters. The summer also brought increased social mixing at the countless dances and social events organized to boost morale. The American Red Cross operated clubs throughout Britain, and while some catered specifically to black troops, others remained integrated. These spaces became laboratories of racial interaction, watched anxiously by both military authorities and civilians. At a June dance in Ipswich, a confrontation crystallized the ongoing tensions. White soldiers from Mississippi arrived at a hall where black soldiers were dancing with British women. The white soldiers demanded the black troops leave, citing Southern customs. The British women, led by a factory worker named Dorothy Harrison, refused to stop dancing with their partners. "This is England," Dorothy declared, according to witnesses who later reported the incident. "You don't tell us who we can dance with? You don't like it? You can leave." The white soldiers did leave, but not before threatening violence. The incident received coverage in local newspapers and further cemented British sympathy for black troops who appeared to be victims of irrational prejudice. British civilians increasingly viewed white Southern soldiers as the problem, not black troops who generally behaved courteously, and military police reports from that summer, preserved in U.S. National Archives, document hundreds of racial incidents overwhelmingly initiated by white troops attacking black soldiers who were socializing with British civilians. These reports troubled commanders who recognized that racial violence among American troops was undermining military effectiveness and damaging America's reputation. The British government continued its delicate balancing act. In Parliament, questions arose about American racial policies and whether Britain should more actively resist segregation. The government's responses, carefully worded, acknowledged concerns while emphasizing the need for Allied unity. But privately, officials expressed growing frustration with what they saw as American domestic problems exported to British soil. Black soldiers' letters home during this period reveal their complex feelings about the experience. They appreciated British hospitality while remaining aware that Britain itself maintained a vast colonial empire built on racial hierarchies. They recognized that British kindness toward them didn't necessarily extend to Indians, Africans, or other colonial subjects. Yet the contrast with American segregation remains stark and meaningful. "The British aren't perfect," wrote Sergeant Marcus Johnson to his brother in July. "They've got their own problems with how they treat colored folks in their colonies. But here in England, they treat us like men. They look you in the eye, they shake your hand. Their daughters dance with you without fear." It makes you realize segregation isn't natural or necessary. It's a choice white folks at home make every day. August 1942 witnessed the racial tensions that had simmered throughout the summer erupt into open violence. The catalyst came in the small market town of Bamber Bridge in Lancashire, where a confrontation between American military police and black soldiers resulted in what would later be called the Battle of Bamber. Bridge, one of the most serious racial incidents involving American troops during the war. The 853rd Aviation Engineer Battalion had been stationed near Bamber Bridge since June. The black soldiers had developed friendly relationships with local civilians, who welcomed them into pubs and homes. This hospitality infuriated white American military police, who attempted to enforce segregation in the town's establishments. On the evening of August 24th, military police tried to arrest Private Eugene Nunn for being improperly dressed while visiting a pub. The arrest attempt sparked confrontation as other black soldiers came to Nunn's defense. Local British civilians sided with the soldiers against the military police. Within hours, the situation escalated dramatically. According to witness accounts compiled by military investigators, white military police reinforcements arrived and attempted to disarm black soldiers. Shots were fired, who shot first remains disputed, and the confrontation transformed into a firefight that lasted several hours. British civilians provided shelter to black soldiers fleeing the military police, hiding them in homes and barns. One black soldier died, and several others suffered wounds. The British response to the incident proved remarkable. Local civilians almost universally supported the black troops, viewing them as victims of aggressive and unjust military police actions. The town's pubs posted signs declaring black troops only, a deliberate inversion of American segregation signs. British police declined to assist American military police in rounding up black soldiers who'd fled into the town. "The colored troops have behaved themselves admirably," reported the local police superintendent to his superiors. The trouble was caused by American military police attempting to enforce their Jim Crow laws on British soil. "Our townsfolk will not stand for it." The Bamber Bridge incident received extensive coverage in British newspapers and caused considerable embarrassment for American military authorities. It forced General Eisenhower to confront the unsustainability of attempting to maintain rigid segregation in Britain. While he couldn't abandon segregation entirely, political pressure from Washington wouldn't allow it. He issued orders reducing military police harassment of black troops and curtailing attempts to enforce segregation in British civilian spaces. The incident also caught the attention of the African American press in the United States. "British town supports Negro troops against MPs," declared a headline in the Pittsburgh Courier. The coverage presented British working-class civilians as more enlightened than white American authorities, a narrative that simultaneously inspired black Americans and angered segregationists. In Parliament, Labour MP Tom Dryburgh raised questions about the incident, criticizing American racial policies and calling on the British government to protect black American troops from discrimination on British soil. While the government's response remained diplomatically cautious, the fact that the issue was debated in Parliament elevated it to a matter of national policy rather than local curiosity. The autumn months following Bamber Bridge saw continued tensions, but also growing accommodation. American authorities, recognizing they couldn't enforce rigid segregation in Britain, increasingly adopted what they called voluntary separation, maintaining segregated facilities on bases, while not actively policing social mixing in civilian areas. This compromise satisfied no one fully but reduced violent confrontations. Black soldiers continued forming relationships with British women, leading to numerous marriages and eventually biracial children. These relationships caused anxiety among American segregationists who feared race mixing but found they had little practical ability to prevent it. British families who accepted black American sons-in-law often faced ostracism from some neighbors, but also found support from others who admired their principles. The experience of being treated with basic dignity had profound psychological effects on black troops. Many later cited their time in Britain as transformative, showing them that racial equality was possible and that segregation was a choice, not an inevitability. This awareness would contribute to the post-war civil rights movement as veterans returned home, unwilling to accept the racial status quo. Meanwhile, white American troops struggled with the situation. Those from northern states often adapted relatively agilely, sometimes even defending their black comrades against harassment. But southern troops frequently expressed outrage at British social customs, viewing them as dangerous violations of racial order. These attitudes sometimes led to continued confrontations, though military authorities increasingly punished white soldiers who started racial incidents. January 1943 through June 1944 marked a period of massive military buildup in Britain as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of France. The racial dynamics that had caused such controversy in previous years became embedded features of American military presence, neither fully resolved nor completely suppressed. The African American presence in Britain expanded dramatically during this period. By early 1944, approximately 130,000 black American troops were stationed in Britain, comprising roughly 10% of total U.S. forces in the European theater. These men worked primarily in support roles: transportation, engineering, supply, though combat units like the 99th Pursuit Squadron also prepared for action. The relationship between black troops and British civilians deepened during these preparation months. Families in towns near American bases developed lasting connections with individual soldiers. Children who'd never seen black people before the war now played in streets where black soldiers distributed candy and gifts. British women continued forming romantic relationships with black troops, despite social pressures and warnings about post-war difficulties. Mary Johnson, a young woman from Somerset, fell in love with Staff Sergeant David Williams from South Carolina. Their relationship scandalized some of her family, but received support from her mother, who'd been widowed early in the war. "David's a good man," Mary wrote in her diary. "He's kind and gentle, and makes me laugh even in these dark times. I don't care what color he is. We've all seen enough death to know that what matters is who people are inside." Stories like Mary and David's played out across Britain, creating thousands of interracial relationships that would have been impossibly and often illegal in many parts of America. These relationships represented perhaps the most profound challenge to American racial ideology. They demonstrated that racial boundaries were socially constructed rather than natural or inevitable. The American military's response to this reality remained conflicted. Official policy still mandated segregation on bases and in military facilities, but authorities largely abandoned attempts to control soldiers' behavior in British civilian spaces. This pragmatic compromise allowed military operations to proceed while avoiding the destructive confrontations of earlier years. Training exercises brought white and black troops into closer cooperation. While units remained segregated, the practical demands of preparing for DAT required coordination across racial lines. White officers commanded black units, and increasingly, these relationships evolved from simple hierarchy to mutual respect based on competence and shared purpose. Colonel William Harrison, a white officer from Maryland commanding a black transportation battalion, underwent a personal transformation during this period. Initially skeptical of black soldiers' abilities, he gradually recognized their skill and dedication. In letters to his wife, preserved in military archives, Harrison expressed growing doubt about segregation. "These men are soldiers," he wrote in March 1944. "They perform their duties with excellence. They demonstrate courage and intelligence. Everything I was taught about Negro inferiority seems questionable now. Perhaps we've been wrong about a great many things." Such conversions, while not universal, occurred frequently enough to suggest that close contact and shared purpose could erode racial prejudice. The war created conditions where white Americans couldn't avoid working alongside black Americans, and many discovered their assumptions were unfounded. The British public, meanwhile, grew accustomed to the black American presence. What had been shocking novelty in 1942 became familiar routine by 1944. Children's books published during this period sometimes featured illustrations of black American soldiers. BBC broadcasts included interviews with black troops as unremarkable features of programming. The normalization of black Americans in British society, while limited and temporary, represented a significant shift. As D-Day approached, black units intensified their preparations. Transportation battalions practiced loading and unloading procedures. Engineering units rehearsed bridge building and road repair. The 99th Pursuit Squadron, which had already seen combat in North Africa, prepared to provide air support for the invasion. These men knew they would play crucial roles in the coming offensive, regardless of how their country valued them. The night before D-Day, June 5, 1944, saw British families across the south of England bidding farewell to American soldiers, both black and white, who would soon embark for Normandy. In Portsmouth, a black engineer named Private Thomas Anderson sat in a church where British and American troops prayed together before the invasion. The service made no racial distinctions. All were simply soldiers facing uncertain fate. "We prayed together," Anderson later recalled. "Black and white, American and British, all of us asking God for courage and victory. In that moment, the artificial divisions fell away. We were just men, scared and hopeful, united in purpose." June 6, 1944, transformed everything. D-Day, Allied invasion of Normandy, represented the culmination of years of preparation and the beginning of the final campaign to defeat Nazi Germany. Black American troops played crucial roles in the operation, even as they remained largely segregated within the military structure. The first black soldiers reached Normandy beaches on D-Day itself. Units like the 327th Quartermaster Service Company landed at Utah Beach under heavy fire. Tasked with unloading supplies essential to the invasion's success, despite being designated support troops, these men faced the same dangers as combat infantry artillery fire, air attacks, and the chaos of amphibious assault. Private First Class Waverly Woodson of the 327th became something of a legend that day. Despite being wounded by shrapnel when his landing craft hit a mine, Woodson spent 30 hours treating injured soldiers on the beach. He set up a medical station in the partial shelter of a seawall and worked tirelessly, saving numerous lives before collapsing from blood loss and exhaustion. His actions epitomized the courage and dedication of black troops, though he was denied the Medal of Honor that his commanders recommended, a slight that wouldn't be remedied for generations. Back in Britain, the remaining black units intensified their work supporting the invasion. Transportation battalions ran around-the-clock operations, moving supplies to southern ports. Engineers maintained the infrastructure necessary for the massive logistical effort. The work was unglamorous, but absolutely essential to military success. The British civilians who'd befriended black American troops followed the invasion news anxiously. Many families had formed genuine attachments to individual soldiers and worried for their safety. Letters flowed between Britain and the European continent, maintaining connections forged during the years of preparation. Sarah Mitchell from Birmingham had been writing to Corporal James Washington since he'd been stationed near her city in 1942. When she learned his unit had landed in France, she wrote, "Please stay safe. You've become like a brother to our family. We pray for you every night. Come back to us when this terrible war finally ends." Such sentiments, repeated in thousands of letters and conversations, testified to the bonds that had developed despite, perhaps because of the unusual circumstances of the war. Black Americans had found acceptance in Britain that their own country denied them, creating loyalties and affections that transcended racial boundaries. As the campaign in Europe progressed, racial dynamics within the American military began shifting. The desperate need for combat troops led to an unprecedented experiment: the integration of black soldiers into white combat units. The Army called for black volunteers to serve in integrated platoons. Thousands volunteered, including many who took voluntary demotions from non-commissioned officer ranks to serve as privates in integrated units. These men welcomed the opportunity to fight, even at the cost of rank and pay. The integrated platoons generally performed well. The post-war surveys showing that white soldiers who fought alongside black troops developed much more positive racial attitudes. "I never thought I'd say this," wrote Private John Thompson from Georgia after fighting in an integrated platoon, "but those colored boys can fight. They're brave soldiers." I was wrong about a lot of things. This combat integration, while limited and temporary, demonstrated that racial integration could work effectively even in the most stressful circumstances. The experiment's success would later provide arguments for the complete desegregation of the armed forces that occurred in 1948 under President Harry Truman. Meanwhile, the British continued hosting black American troops throughout late 1944 and 1945. Some units remained in Britain for the war's duration, while others rotated through on their way to or from the continent. The relationships and attitudes that had developed earlier in the war now seemed normal rather than novel. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, black American troops had served with distinction in virtually every theater of the war. They'd driven trucks through enemy fire, built bridges under artillery bombardment, nursed the wounded, and fought in combat. They'd proven themselves capable soldiers while maintaining their dignity in the face of segregation and discrimination. May 1945 brought victory in Europe, but complex questions about what came next. Black American troops who'd served in Britain faced the prospect of returning to a segregated society that had changed little despite their sacrifices. Many had formed relationships with British women and now contemplated difficult choices about their futures. The marriages between black American soldiers and British women became a significant issue. Military authorities estimated that approximately 1,900 such marriages occurred during the war, and thousands more relationships had formed. These couples faced daunting obstacles. American immigration law made it difficult for war brides to enter the United States. When they did arrive, they encountered Jim Crow segregation that shocked women accustomed to British social norms. Dorothy Williams had married Sergeant Robert Williams from Alabama in a small ceremony in Devon in 1944. When she arrived in Mobile in late 1945, she encountered segregation for the first time. "I couldn't believe it," she later recalled in an oral history. "Separate doors for colored and white, separate drinking fountains, separate everything." Robert had tried to warn me, but I couldn't imagine it until I saw it. Cried for weeks. Some British war brides couldn't adjust to American segregation and returned to Britain, sometimes with children. Others stayed, becoming quiet witnesses to the injustices of Jim Crow and sometimes advocates for change. Their presence in black communities across America represented a small but significant international dimension to the civil rights struggle. For the soldiers themselves, the contrast between their treatment in Britain and America became unbearable for many. They'd experienced being treated with basic human dignity, being welcomed into pubs and homes, forming friendships across racial lines. Returning to segregation felt like a betrayal of everything they'd fought for. "We fought for freedom overseas," said Private James Anderson at a gathering of black veterans in Chicago in December 1945. "But we came home to the same old discrimination. We defeated Hitler's racist ideology in Germany, but we still face American racist ideology at home. Something has to change." This sentiment, shared by thousands of black veterans, contributed significantly to the post-war civil rights movement. Veterans like Medgar Evers, who'd served in Europe, returned home determined to challenge segregation. Their military service had given them organizational skills, leadership experience, and perhaps most importantly, the knowledge that racial equality was possible because they'd experienced it in Britain. The British perspective on the experience evolved over time. During the immediate post-war period, Britain faced its own severe economic challenges and social upheaval. The warm memories of American troops, both black and white, gave way to other concerns. Yet individual Britons who'd befriended black Americans maintained those connections when possible, exchanging letters and occasional visits. Some British citizens who'd witnessed American segregation in action became critics of racial injustice. Having seen the arbitrariness and cruelty of Jim Crow enforced on British soil, they found it harder to ignore similar injustices in Britain's own colonial system. The experience of hosting black American troops contributed in small ways to the gradual evolution of British racial attitudes in the post-war decades. The town of Bamber Bridge, site of the 1942 confrontation, erected a memorial decades later honoring the black American troops who'd been stationed there. The memorial acknowledged both the friendship that had developed between soldiers and townspeople and the injustice of the segregation system that had caused the violence. It represented a conscious effort to remember a complex history honestly. Academic studies of the period began appearing in the 1970s and 80s. As historians gained access to military records and conducted oral histories with aging veterans and British civilians, these studies, including Graham Smith's When Jim Crow Met John Bull, published in 1987, documented the social dynamics of the period in detail. The research revealed patterns that participants had understood only partially at the time. How class dynamics in Britain influenced reactions to black troops, how regional variations in British attitudes affected the experience, and how the encounter challenged assumptions on all sides. The African American veterans themselves began organizing reunions, sometimes returning to Britain to visit places they'd been stationed. These visits occasioned emotional reunions with British families who'd befriended them decades earlier.
Elderly.
British women embraced elderly black American men, rekindling friendships formed in youth during extraordinary circumstances. "Coming back here feels like coming home in some ways," said James Mitchell, the sergeant who'd arrived in January 1942. When he returned to London for a veterans gathering in 1992, "This city gave me something precious during the war. It gave me dignity. The British treated me like a man when my own country wouldn't. I've never forgotten that." The children born of relationships between black American soldiers and British women represented a living legacy of the wartime encounter. Many of these mixed-race children faced discrimination in Britain, which had its own racial prejudices despite the hospitality shown to American troops. Some were raised by single mothers after their fathers returned to America. Others grew up in families that maintained connections across the Atlantic. Their experiences highlighted the complexity of race relations. Neither Britain nor America had fully resolved questions of racial justice, though they'd approached them differently. The military integration experiment that began during the Battle of the Bulge provided crucial evidence for post-war desegregation efforts. When President Truman issued Executive Order 9817 in July 1948, ordering the desegregation of the armed forces, he cited studies showing that integrated units had performed effectively. The British experience, where black and white troops had served in proximity, if not full integration, contributed to the growing recognition that segregation was militarily inefficient and morally indefensible. 70 years after the end of World War II, The story of Black American troops in Britain continued to resonate, offering lessons about prejudice, humanity, and the possibility of change. The encounter between these soldiers and British civilians represented a moment when racial assumptions confronted lived reality, and reality proved more complex than ideology suggested. The experience demonstrated that racial attitudes were not fixed or inevitable, but rather shaped by social structures, laws, and personal choices. British civilians who'd never met black people before 1942 developed relationships with Black American soldiers that challenged stereotypes. Many discovered that racial prejudice dissolved when they interacted with actual human beings rather than abstractions or colonial subjects at a distance. Conversely, white American troops who'd accepted segregation as natural often found their assumptions challenged by British resistance to Jim Crow. When pub owners refused to enforce racial exclusion, when British women danced with black soldiers, when children befriended black troops without hesitation, the supposed necessity of segregation became harder to maintain. Some white soldiers reconsidered their racial attitudes. Others clung more desperately to them, but none could pretend segregation was universally accepted or inevitable. For Black American soldiers, the British experience provided both hope and frustration. Hope because they'd experienced a society where their skin color didn't automatically relegate them to inferior status. Frustration because this experience made returning to American segregation all the more intolerable. Many veterans became civil rights activists, determined to create in America the dignity and equality they'd glimpsed in Britain. The historical record preserves their voices. In archives across America and Britain, letters, diaries, and oral histories document the period from multiple perspectives. These sources reveal the humanity of all involved, the loneliness of young soldiers far from home, the curiosity of British civilians encountering difference, the stubborn prejudice of segregationists, the courage of those who challenged injustice, and the ordinary kindness that transcended racial boundaries. Historians now recognize this episode as significant beyond its immediate context. It demonstrated how wartime necessity could disrupt racial hierarchies, creating spaces where different social arrangements became possible. It showed how contact between people could erode prejudice, though not automatically or completely. It revealed the political nature of racial segregation, a system that required constant enforcement and that collapsed when authorities declined to support it. The story also illustrates the limitations of wartime change. British hospitality toward Black American troops didn't extend to challenging the racial hierarchies of the British Empire. The same Britons who welcomed Black Gs often supported continued colonialism in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. This contradiction suggests that opposition to American segregation came partly from British national pride and anti-American sentiment rather than pure commitment to racial equality. Similarly, the positive experiences of black troops in Britain didn't immediately transform American society. Returning veterans faced the same segregation they'd left, and it would take decades of struggle before legal barriers fell. The civil rights movement required sustained organizing, sacrifice, and courage. The British experience contributed to that movement, but didn't cause it or make it inevitable. Modern descendants of those who lived through this period carry the legacy forward. The children and grandchildren of Black American veterans and British war brides maintain family histories that span the Atlantic. Organizations dedicated to preserving World War II history increasingly include the racial dynamics of the period in their narratives. Recognizing that the war for freedom abroad was complicated by the denial of freedom at home, educational curricula in both countries now sometimes include this history. Teaching students about the complexity of the good war, young people learn that the Allied fight against Nazi tyranny was morally compromised by American segregation and British colonialism. Yet this doesn't negate the genuine evil of fascism or the courage of those who fought it. History, these lessons suggest, is complicated, full of contradictions and moral ambiguity, even in moments of apparent clarity. The encounter between Black American troops and British civilians during World War II ultimately represents a moment of possibility, time when different ways of organizing society became visible and when individuals, on all sides, glimpsed alternatives to the racial systems they'd inherited. That such moments occurred doesn't mean progress was inevitable or automatic. The struggle for racial justice required and continues to require conscious choice, courage, and sustained effort. But the fact that ordinary people, pub owners in Bamber Bridge, families in London, soldiers from Alabama and Chicago, could look past racial categories and recognize common humanity matters. It suggests that the barriers dividing people are not natural or insurmountable, but rather constructed and maintained by human choice. And what human choice has created, human choice can change. The story ends not with triumphant resolution, but with complex legacy. Black American veterans returned home changed by their experiences, carrying memories of dignity and equality that fueled their determination to challenge segregation. British civilians who'd befriended these soldiers carried forward their own complicated understanding of race, sometimes applying lessons learned to their own society's injustices. White Americans who'd witnessed British resistance to Jim Crow faced questions about the necessity and morality of segregation. Decades later, an elderly James Mitchell returned to London and embraced elderly Margaret Thornton, the girl who'd pressed her face against the window in January 1942. They represented the enduring human connections forged during those extraordinary years. Their friendship, maintained through letters across decades and oceans, testified to the possibility of connection across difference. "I remember the first time I saw you and your soldiers," Margaret told James during that reunion, now both in their 90s. "I'd never seen anyone with dark skin before. I was curious and a bit frightened, I suppose. But then we met at a church social, and you were just a young man far from home, polite and kind. You taught me that people are people, whatever they look like. It seems such a simple lesson, but I'm not sure I'd have learned it without the war bringing you to London." James smiled, his eyes distant with memory. "And you British taught us that segregation wasn't the only way, that kindness across color lines was possible. We never forgot that. Many of us spent our lives trying to create that same dignity at home." Their conversation, preserved in an oral history project, captures the essential humanity of the wartime encounter. Beyond the politics and policies, beyond the military strategies and diplomatic tensions, real people met across racial lines and discovered their common humanity. That discovery replicated thousands of times in pubs and dance halls. Churches and homes across Britain represented a small revolution in consciousness, one whose ripples continue to spread through time, reminding each generation that the barriers dividing us are less natural and less necessary than we often assume.